I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we examine the latest from Kursk as Ukrainian forces rush to close the pocket thought to contain thousands of Russian troops. And we hear how Ukraine is preparing an anticipated prisoner of war exchange, and why the issue of returning Asov fighters is now a political question for President Zelensky.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 20th of August, 2 years and 183 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and Ukrainian journalist Svitlana Morenets. I started with updates from the battlefronts in Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian forces have continued to marginally advance in Kursk Oblast, mainly to the northeast, east and southeast, so that sector of Sudza. They're also, though, pushing southwest from Koronovo, attempting to close the gap to the River Seine so as to ensure Russian forces caught between the river and the border with Ukraine are trapped. Now the bridges appear to have been destroyed. It's worth noting there has been no confirmation from Ukrainian authorities that the westernmost bridge of the three near the town of Kariz has been dropped. Those reports only coming from Russian mill blogger community, although there are a lot of them, and they are some of the more occasionally correct Russian mill bloggers, we should say. So it does look as if that third bridge at Kariz has been either dropped or rendered inoperable for heavy machinery and armour and what have you. Also on the bridges, it's worth noting there are two other crossings just to the north of the town of Tetkino. Now that's right in the far west of the pocket Ukraine is attacking into in Kursk. It's thought that Russia dropped those bridges themselves by, well, it's a reserve demolition, as it's called in military parlance. It's there to deny the use of the bridges to your enemy. If you think you're going backwards, they're very important things, bridges, and so you don't want to blow them up if you don't have to. But if you think that you are going backwards and you need to deny their use to the enemy, then you would blow them up yourself. The river at that part effectively forms the border. So it's thought that Russia has dropped those two bridges to stop any more incursions from Ukraine. Now then, the Russian MOD claimed that they had attack helicopters and artillery that had hit Ukrainian forces near Vishnevka. That's about 10 k's south-southwest of Koronovo. That's a good indicator of how far Ukrainian forces have got. Vishnevka is about 1 kilometre from the river. The river at that point runs in from the west and then turns sharply north to run further into Russia. So if Ukraine can get to that river, they effectively close the box. There's a box then with the northern side is the river, southern side, and the western side is the border, and in the east is the land that Ukraine hold inside Russia. Julian Rupke of Bild, a German media outlet, says that the Ukrainian army is tracking Russian pontoon bridge building attempts over the River Seine in real time and destroying trucks and equipment as soon as they arrive with first-person view drones. There's footage, including from his Twitter site, of drones hitting trucks reported to be attempting to build temporary pontoon bridges over the river. The images were tagged as from Sunday, but it's impossible for us to verify that. And builds say that about 3,000 Russian troops could be trapped in that pocket south of the river. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty say one of at least two pontoon bridges built over the same river is no longer visible in satellite imagery, and smoke is detected in the area. This is from images yesterday. They're citing images recorded by NASA satellites, and they say the pontoon bridge built by the Russian military between Zvano and Glushkovo, they're the towns hosting the first two bridges to be destroyed. The pontoon bridge that had been visible was no longer visible yesterday, and there's a large column of smoke 500 metres away from the pontoon crossing's previous spot. They say the other pontoon bridge near Glushkovo is still visible, although I think they're having trouble finding volunteers to go and work on it. And then Dan Sabat and his colleague Luke Harding from The Guardian, they're in Kyiv. They've been interviewing a senior Ukrainian official, and this individual says the situation is messy there. The Russians have pulled in extra troops. Some are capable, some are not. The Russians have found it extremely difficult to recapture lost territory. Now, the official they spoke to said Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Serhii, was waging a, quote, high-speed campaign with his troops constantly on the move. Serhii wants to avoid a dug-in positional war similar to the one taking place in the east, the official added, saying it's risky, but the narrative of the war has changed. Everything is possible. Now, Russia's state news agency TASS, quoting the Emergencies Ministry earlier today, report that 122,000 people have been evacuated from Russia's Kursk region since the incursion started 2 weeks ago. And Russian MOD also claimed that their forces had repelled Ukrainian sabotage, what they called sabotage and reconnaissance attempts south of Skrilivka and Sheptikova. They're both about 10 k's northeast of Koronova. Again, giving you a bit of an idea as to how far Ukraine is progressing each day. Now then, just last one on this section. Chechen Akhmat commander Apti Aludinov, who is also a Russian defense official, he's speaking again, aggravating the situation a bit more. You'll remember he caused a stir by openly acknowledging the Ukrainian advance into Kursk in the first couple of days of the incursion, at a time when Moscow was still saying it was just what do they say? It was a raid or a minor recce, or what a counter-terrorism job. It was all under control. Aludinov spoke out and said, no, it's bigger than that, which caused a few feathers to be ruffled. And then in a video message yesterday, he criticised what he called, quote, the sobs and outbursts, unquote, of Russian conscripts fighting in Kursk Oblast, complaining that parents of conscripts are treating 18-year-olds as children. He said conscripts are employees of the Russian Ministry of Defense and should therefore get on with it, defend Russia. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, say family members of Russian conscripts have been complaining about their loved ones being used to fight in Kursk. We know this is a hot topic, the whole issue about conscripts. We know Putin and the Kremlin do worry about backlash, any backlash from society regarding issues concerning conscripts, which makes Aludinov's intervention all the more welcome and interesting. Now, he also complained, this is Aludinov, also complained that conscripts are, quote, just eating the state's bread for free and then go home. Responding to complaints that conscripts are paid little, he said they should just sign a contract with the MOD if they want to receive higher salaries, and called for all Russians, young and old, to stand in formation since the enemy has come to Russia. He said, no one will die who is not destined to die. But if you die defending Russia and your faith is in God, you will go to heaven. As eve of battle speeches go, it's not quite Henry V, but there we go. Into Ukraine. In the Donbass region, Russian military bloggers reported Moscow's forces have captured the town of New York, adding that they then raised the Russian flag and immediately renamed the town Novgorodsk. Now, New York is about 20 k's north of Donetsk city, about 30 k's south of Bakhmut, and only 40 kilometers east of Pokrovsk. That's the important Ukrainian logistic hub that we reported yesterday was starting to be evacuated. Ukrainian civilians are said to still be leaving the city as the Russia's sort of grinding advance gets closer. Local authorities said Moscow's forces were advancing so quickly that families are now under orders to leave the city, which we said yesterday is still home to 53,000 people, we think, the city and the immediate sort of villages and towns nearby. People from all ages have been seen boarding trains and buses with their belongings, whatever they could carry, small children in their arms. Some were seen in tears, weeping as they waited to depart. This morning, Ukrainian forces say they are under heavy attack around Pokrovsk again. One local, Natalia Ivanyuk, who was leaving her village with her two daughters, said, it was terrifyingly scary. We barely got out. Elsewhere across the country, Ukraine was hit by an aerial attack last night, mainly around the Kyiv area, although elsewhere as well. Ukrainian officials say an Iskander-K and two Kh-59 missiles were fired and shot down, but two other ballistic missiles, thought to be an Iskander-M or North Korean Nk-23, did get through. They say 25 of 26 UAVs were also shot down. An industrial facility in Ternopil in western Ukraine, about 100 k's southeast of Lviv, was hit. And just in the last hour, there's been reports of an increased level of chlorine air concentration reported by the authorities there. Oksana Chenuk, who's the head of the Regional Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, has warned residents to limit their exposure outdoors and to close all windows. Elsewhere, shelling in Sumy, northern Sumy Oblast, cut the power to about 20,000 people. I note, sort of dipping back into Russia briefly, there was also a large power cut in the Moscow region, although no indication of how that occurred, no reports of drone strikes. A couple more for me. Freelance journalist Tim White says that fire at the oil depot in Proletask that we reported on yesterday is still burning. He cites sources in Russia that says 22 of 70 fuel tanks are either in flames or already burnt out, but the blaze is still expanding. It's very big, 1,500 square meters. Images on social media, it's causing a big problem there. And the Czech Republic, Czechia, is going to use part of the interest generated from Russian assets frozen in the EU to buy large caliber ammunition for Ukraine. This is Czechia's Defence Minister Jana Černochová making the announcement earlier today. This move follows the EU agreeing in June, you'll remember, to use about 1.4 billion, big B billion euros, 1.2 billion quid, in profits from Russia's frozen assets for arms and other aid to Ukraine. Another billion euro is expected to become available by the end of this year. And just finally for me, Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs Tobias Billström has tweeted a clip from an interview he gave with DW News, a German media company, in which he says, "We have never," that's Sweden, "we have never put any restrictions on the weapons that we have delivered to Ukraine, and we do not intend to do it now. Ukraine has put those weapons to good use." Just adds to this pressure, maybe that's too strong, debate around permissions given to what Ukraine should and shouldn't be able to do with the weapons that it's been gifted. But for more on the international front, delighted to welcome back the F-bomb, the original gangster himself. Francis, welcome back. What have you been looking at on the international front?
Thanks, Tom. Good to be back. We predicted last week that it was likely that for as long as the Kursk operation continues, all the talk about negotiations and ceasefires, at least from Moscow, would likely pause until they have the situation under control, revealing in and of itself that they only wanted to enter those negotiations when they had a firm handle on the front lines in the hope that they could hold on to territory. Now, today we're seeing more evidence that that prediction we made is true, with Russia ruling out any peace talks with Ukraine once again. So an aide last night said, at the current stage, given this escapade, we will not talk. Entering a negotiating process would be completely inappropriate, and any future talks will depend on the situation on the battlefield, he said, including in the Kursk region. Now, I expect that will be the line that is stuck to for the foreseeable, though it was interesting last week, as we commented upon, to see Lukashenko in Belarus start talking about Ukraine already being denazified now and that the time has come to stop the conflict. Was that a signal from Moscow that they are still willing to talk? Or was that Belarus going out on its own in alarm at the evolving situation close to their own border? The truth will out, no doubt, but we shouldn't expect a public reversal in Moscow's obstinacy anytime soon, however severe the situation becomes. And we'll talk with Svitlana later about Kyiv's objectives in that operation and indeed the risks for President Zelensky personally. Whatever foresight or not that Western powers had about the Kursk operation, and I know that's been a subject of some consideration over the last few days, I think we can safely assume now, given Kyiv's statements since, that it was hoping the operation's success would unlock more weapons permissions for them, not least from Britain, where the row about clarifying London's position on the use of storm shadows rumbles on. My own view, and it is just my view, is that the new government doesn't want to state publicly yes or no and try and keep up the facade of strategic ambiguity. But Washington has now made it known that London has not approached them for permissions that are a prerequisite. So any ambiguity there was has arguably vanished now. And instead, it just appears to be a firm no on Storm Shadow permissions. Now, if that is not the case, then London will have to change tack, because that is, as I say, now the perception. It bears repeating, as Jack Watling over The Weekend wrote in The Guardian that whilst the political power behind the Kursk operation was clearly a core objective, there were major military ramifications, especially in the targeting of Russian airfields, as we discussed with Michael Bernhardt of RAND on Friday's episode. So it is strongly, many would argue, in the interests of Western nations to grant more permissions now to ensure Kyiv can make the most of its successes in targeting those airfields and other vital resources. Now, as Watling underscored in his piece, a long-term challenge posed by Ukraine's operation is the equipment that is being lost. Whatever happens in November, it could be either a complete severance of material, which would make a very, very challenging situation indeed, or still, under Harris, a limited granting and giving of equipment. So it is not in ample supply. And that means that this incursion is using material that cannot be used in large-scale offensives next year, which we're being prepared for. So this operation means critical vehicles and personnel necessary for future offensives will not be able to do that, have been committed, one might argue, prematurely. So this operation does limit future options, but they've made the calculation that it is worth it. And as Watling concludes, whilst the immediate news from Kursk may have caused optimism, this should not distract Ukraine's partners from helping to stabilise the broader front. And that's the key point here with regards to weapons being unlocked, is perhaps they hope that this would be the big thing that would mean that people were willing to unleash some of the shackles. But not all of them have. And there are some positive sounds, but there are some negative ones too. And so it's a complicated picture, but nonetheless very interesting. And I imagine we'll see some progress on this, or some developments and comment from London over the coming days. Now, on to another news, Dom. Putin visited Azerbaijan over the weekend, likely in an effort to shift focus away from Kursk and present himself as a continually effective diplomat. The Kremlin said that it's still committed to its historic role of mediating peace negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, especially following that crisis around September time last year when we were in Washington as it was all erupting. Now, we'll have James Kilner on again soon to discuss more about the significance of this. But this is being widely interpreted as Moscow trying to underline that things are going on as normal, that this is not a crisis. And so Putin is still able to travel abroad because they have Kursk under control. Of course, it still wants to be a wider power broker internationally, hence the importance of these kind of trips. So interesting. Now, a couple more stories which caught my eye on what is inevitably a slightly quieter period politically over the summer because so many governments are away on recess. Peter Pavel, president of Czechia, believes that Ukraine's NATO accession should not depend on regaining full control over all of its territory. It's fascinating, this. So in a joint interview with Czech media outlets Novinky and Pravo, and as reported by Ukrainian Pravda, he stated, and I quote, "If there is a demarcation, even of some administrative border, then we will be able to recognise this administrative border as a temporary state border and allow Ukraine to join NATO with the territory it will control at that moment." Now, that is a clear indication, as you're going to get, of how certain countries are pushing for a way to find post-war security guarantees for Kyiv that will prevent Moscow ever being able to launch an invasion again, perhaps the key to a lasting peace. But many NATO countries will not agree to this line unless the political ground shifts quite extensively, which means perhaps it will be up to individual countries offering commitments to Kyiv outside of NATO's Article 5. We shall see. But nonetheless, a very interesting sign there of the kind of conversations and signalling that no doubt is happening a lot behind closed doors between European powers as they try and find a way where, if there are negotiations and if there is some territory that Kyiv is obliged to concede, that there have to be security guarantees that are watertight to ensure that it cannot erupt. And Pavel is basically trying to proactively come out against one of the major objections, which would be, well, how can we agree any security guarantees when the borders of Ukraine are not agreed? And he's saying that even if they were temporarily agreed, or even if they were agreed for a fixed period but were still malleable, that those borders could be used as a basis for NATO membership. As I say, knowing what we know about Europe and NATO, I don't believe they're going to go for this, unfortunately, from the perspective of many people supporting Ukraine. But nonetheless, it does show that conversations are happening at a very high level about what security guarantees are required. So continue to watch this space and we'll keep you updated. Just lastly, we've talked a lot recently about the sanctions issue. Possibly the best summary I've read so far, beyond Ed Conway's heroic work reporting into the sanctions loopholes, has been produced by The Economist in a piece titled "The Mysterious Middlemen Helping Russia's War Machine." Now, whilst it's not reporting masses that Mr. Conway hasn't already reported for Sky News, and indeed we've done in The Telegraph on other elements of this story, it lays out the picture very starkly, looking at how Western countries are selling components to third-party countries, which are then likely sold on to Moscow. And the piece talks again about the Kazakhstan example and gives some more numbers which are just staggering. So it's tiny tech industry, some 50 firms with a production capacity of 100 million in 2021, seems to have filled the gap. It exports to Russia rose from $40 million in 2021 to $298 million in 2023. Electric imports from Europe also increased from 250 million euros to 709 million euros. So this is a prime example of how third-party nations are buying up what Moscow would have been buying and then selling it on to Moscow. Now, as the piece highlights, for Europe's policymakers, this is all bad news. We expected some leakage, it quotes an official as saying, but not on the scale we now know about. In December, and this is the piece again, the EU's 12th round of restrictions targeting firms in Armenia and Uzbekistan for the first time came into place. Bureaucrats have since threatened more sanctions on third countries and Europeans exporting to them, but have taken action only against a few firms. For each firm added to the blacklist, another is registered elsewhere. And then it goes on, I think this is the most valuable bit in the piece, of talking about what are the ways of trying to get a grip on this. So as a real solution would require enlisting the help of the governments of the Caucasus and Central Asia. That is a tall order. Regional politicians value their closeness to Moscow and often profit personally from the rule breaking via corruption. Still, the Europeans could offer them goodies. Armenia recently started to shut down firms targeting and trading with Russia after the EU awarded it 270 million euros in aid, loans and contracts. Alternatively, Europe could use sticks rather than carrots. It could extend export bans to third countries or restrict their banks. That could anger Europe's remaining sources of gas in Azerbaijan and hurt European firms. The question is whether the EU thinks that the benefit to Ukraine of a tighter sanctions regime is worth it. Its current approach suggests it doesn't. So that's the piece in The Economist there, and we'll add a link in the show notes. But just a final reflection on this. There is some hope. The EU is doing not as much as many would hope, but the UK has shown there is a way. So to quote Robin Brooks of the Brookings Institute, the UK deserves enormous praise for clamping down on exports to Russia via third countries. The UAE, for example, is a big transshipment hub for Western goods. Whenever there is a spike in UK exports to UAE, it is very short-lived. Compared to this, the EU is just a total morass, and he offers various graphs where you see those spikes go up at key moments in the war and then those spikes massively dropping off, clearly as measures are being adopted to stop those third countries receiving those goods that are going on then to Moscow. So there is a way, but it requires a real strength and commitment of purpose, which it would appear that the EU institutionally is lacking, but the UK has shown there is a way on an individual country basis, and whether other countries will be seeking to do that individually too remains to be seen. So that's where we are, Dom, on the political realm on another eventful day.
Thanks, Francis. I mean, the whole sanctions thing I find really, really interesting. Coming to a head now, we talked about this briefly last week. The sanctions regime is so leaky that there are sanctioned entities and elements such as microelectronics that are getting into the Russian defence industrial base, being put in missiles and fired back at Ukraine. So the argument is saying, why should Ukraine not be allowed access to these munitions, for example, or these components that go into long-range munitions to fire into Russia, if Russia is seeming allowed or not prevented from getting them to fire back at Ukraine? So either allow Ukraine to do what it likes with the munitions or tighten up the blooming sanctions regime, or do both. Anyway, We will track that one. Thank you. Thanks, Francis. Now, we're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Svitlana Morenets of The Spectator, just back from a trip back home to Ukraine. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Svitlana, about what's going on in the Ukrainian parliament. Lots of stuff going on there. But first, you've written a piece for The Spectator on the Kursk offensive, how it's been received. Very keen to hear about that. But also, you've been concentrating on the role that you think this sort of vaunted, this suggested likely prisoner of war exchange is going to have, that Kyiv seems to be preparing for. What have you been looking at there?
Hi, thank you for having me back again. I would like to give some context first. I returned from Ukraine's frontline in Kharkiv and Donetsk regions 2 weeks before the Kursk offensive happened. And at that time, the situation on the battlefield seemed very grim. The Russian frontline looked impossible to break through, and the Ukrainian army was severely affected by a shortage of infantry and personnel. There were also significant issues with military motivations, leading to soldiers abandoning their positions, essentially what is desertion. These soldiers preferred facing several years in prison over risking their lives in a war that Ukraine seemed to be losing. They were blaming the West for not sending enough weapons to Ukraine and also imposing these red lines and all kind of restrictions on the Ukrainian army about how they should fight the war in Russia. Also, they were blaming their Ukrainian countrymen for not enlisting into the army, avoiding conscription, which basically led to Ukraine having a big shortage of soldiers on the front line. And opinions of the Ukrainian civilians have been shifting too. The last poll showed that 44% of them wanted to start talk with Russia, but at the same time they were not ready to make any concessions. And Zelensky also, he no longer talked about reclaiming all occupied land by force. He started to say that it could be recovered in diplomatic ways too. So with US elections approaching, it seemed that talks with Russia were inevitable and Kyiv would be at the table as a losing side, with nothing left to bargain. That's why I see the Kursk offensive as Zelensky's last shot to turn the tide in the war. So far, he succeeded in at least boosting the morale of both the military and civilians. The war felt worth fighting again. And I want to stress that Zelensky communicates the Kursk intrusion not something as will bring Ukraine's imminent victory, but something that will end the war. Of course, the offensive protects Ukrainian border regions and creates so-called buffer zone about what Putin was talking about. It creates buffer zone now from Ukrainian side. But it stretches Russian resources and troops, but it also stretches Zelensky. And as Ukrainian best elite units are digging in, constructing fortifications in Kursk region, there will need to be 1,000 soldiers to protect that land. And there is a big risk that with Russia gathering all these troops for counteroffensive, even if for now it seems that all of them are so disorganized and there are fresh conscripts with little weapons, they don't know what to do, but Russia has enough military power to push Ukrainian troops out. So the big risk for Zelensky, if it fails, considering that Russian troops currently advancing in Donetsk region with the possibility of Pokrovsk and Toretsk falling, what would it mean for Zelensky? And I think if Ukraine fails in this operation, then after the US elections, no matter who wins them, Kyiv will be pushed to negotiate with Russia. But for now, the battle lines changed, so any ceasefire, considering the realities on the ground, is impossible because Putin is refusing to negotiate while Ukrainian troops stand on Russian land. And I think it's quite a shift because for months now Russia was talking about negotiations and Ukraine was the one refusing to do them. And now it's the opposite. Zelensky plans to hold a second peace summit this autumn. And he said that Russian representatives must be invited. Otherwise, we won't achieve viable results, he said. And he will release the plan for it right in the time for American elections. So Ukraine will look like the side who wants to negotiate. And I think if in that moment Putin refuses, then the allies will have all the reasons to give Ukraine the weapons to keep fighting. Zelensky right now is pushing for the US, Britain and France to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike deeper into Russia. And he also says that they should prepare the next aid packages because the last delay of almost 9 months was devastating for Ukraine, and Ukraine lost Avdiivka back then and a lot of land in Donetsk region. And he says not to wait until Ukraine runs out of weapons. Approve the aid bills now, and it will help Ukraine's effort a lot. About the prisoner exchange, what I wanted to add is that one of the reasons the Kursk offensive happened is because Russia holds over almost 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers who were defending Azov-style plant in Mariupol in 2022. And back then, when Ukrainian army was set to surrender, Kyiv set them to surrender because the plant was surrounded. Zelensky promised that they will be exchanged in a couple of months, but it has been over 2 years. They were in Russian prisons, and 2 weeks ago, one of the Azov fighters died in Russian prison. And during the martial law, the protests are banned. But when I have been in Ukraine for last months, I saw constant protests in Kyiv with like 100, 200 people with banners asking the government to free Azov-style defenders, especially fighters from the Azov brigade. As Russia considers them terrorist organization, they were not keen to exchange them in these 2 years of war. Very few of them were exchanged, and over 700 stay in Russian prisons for now. So I think it is also a political question for Zelensky and his team right now, because people were quite angry that no Azov fighters were exchanged in 2 years.
Thanks, Svitlana. Francis here. Always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I want to ask about the latest from the Ukrainian parliament, if I may. There is a breaking story today that it's passed a law effectively banning the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, this has been rumbling on for a while. We've been talking about issues on this for many months, and particularly earlier on this year. First of all, can you just give a little bit more context behind this? Because it's not as such the church is shutting down, as I know it can sound. And also just perhaps offer a few reflections on the political reasoning behind this, because it's not without risk, is it?
Yes, of course. First, I would like to say that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine are basically the same churches, but one is run by the Kremlin and one is run by Kyiv. So in March last year, there was a big scandal when the priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate were expelled from Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, a historic Orthodox monastery in the heart of Kyiv. The Russian church had run the monastery for centuries, but this control ended after Russian Orthodox priests were discovered storing Russian passports, literature, Russian flags, and bags of cash in dollars and rubles within the church grounds. Since the start of the war, Russian Orthodox churches in Ukraine have been blamed to be used as Kremlin outposts for spying, spreading propaganda, and praying for the unity of Ruski Mir. The church's leader, Patriarch Kirill, is a close ally of Vladimir Putin and supports the invasion. Also, I would say even in my hometown, we have one church of the Russian Orthodox Church and one of Ukrainian one. And in the Russian Orthodox Church, they were refusing to hold service for a fallen Ukrainian soldier in Ukrainian. And when his mother requested do it in Ukrainian, please, they said no. It was also a big scandal. And it's just one of the examples how the Russian Orthodox Church works and what their views are. So in October, the bill that could potentially outlaw the Moscow-linked religious organizations was voted for in the first reading, but it was not considered until now. And last month, MPs backing a bill staged a big protest in the parliament. They held banners saying the Russian church kills and demanded an immediate review of the law. Eventually, it never took place, and the parliament broke up for a whole month until today. And today, finally, the bill was passed. It will take effect in 30 days after its publication, and these communities will have a 9-month window to sever all connections with the Russian church. If they fail to do so, the matter will be taken to court, which will have the authority to impose a ban. It's a long process, and how effective the law will be remains to be seen. I would say that I'm quite surprised that the bill was voted for now, especially on the eve of the US elections, because there is quite popular narrative right now that could fuel Russian propaganda claiming that Volodymyr Zelensky is persecuting Christians. It's quite popular saying gained traction in the US, particularly in speeches by J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate. So it's quite risky for them to do it right now. They could have waited for US elections to pass. But at the same time, like more than half of the country supports banning the Russian church entirely. To talk about the Russian propaganda about this thing, I want to explain that religious freedom won't be affected if churches switch to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church run by Kyiv. Many have, like less than, I would say, about 15%, and they will have 9 months to do so. And the faithful can still worship in the same churches, in the same language. If they want to do it in Russian, they can do it in Russian, but it will be not under the system run by the Kremlin.
It's interesting you bring up America there, and that being one of the narratives that one often hears Vance talk about. Congress more broadly, I've spoken to people who are engaged with talking to congressmen about Ukraine matters, and they've said that this is one of the biggest obstacles that they come across, is that this story about the banning of the Russian Orthodox Church is misconstrued, misunderstood in its details and its implications by certain Americans, certain prominent Americans, and that this is having some ramifications. And indeed, I've heard also from other sources that it's quite often being used as a means to try and promote certain other narratives that are less obviously true, as it were, but this is used as a gateway story to then pervade other myths. And I think that when this is all over, there might well be uncoverings, shall we say, of some of the individuals who've been behind some of the narratives, particularly in the United States, that it's not exactly all as it appears in terms of the origins of some of those stories which have been being fed into Congress. But anyway, I've said enough about that I can say. Svitlana, one final thing from you, if I may. The Ukrainian parliament, of course, is also going through a big period of frustration from the perspectives of many in Ukraine. We've got draft laws on increasing taxes and defence expenditure being postponed until the beginning of September. Could you just give us a broad overview of the state of Ukrainian parliament and some of the tensions that are currently playing out there?
There have been a lot of criticism because parliament doesn't seem to be working unitedly, and a lot of deputies are missing the parliament sessions. And Zelensky has been struggling to gather the votes from his party and from other parties to push the laws that he needs to. Especially he had to use the votes of MPs from the opposition party that previously was pro-Russian in Ukraine, and now they just vote for everything he says because they are afraid of persecution and imprisonment. So that's quite a problem, and Ukrainian parliament needs to be updated. I mean, the election is very, very much needed, but of course it's not going to happen. And MPs, a lot of them, they submitted the letter saying they want to be fired, they want to leave, but nobody signs it, because if they start leaving, then there will be no one to vote for the laws. They say that the issue that they are not allowed to travel abroad, and they have not had a holiday in over 2 years, but Ukrainians are criticizing this a lot, because they say Ukrainian soldiers have been fighting for over 2 years and you want to go on holiday. We will see how it goes. For now, all the laws Zelensky pushes to them, they just vote for them. I would say it lost its independence, but when country is at war, it has to work like a whole.
Thanks, Svitlana. Really interesting what you were just saying there about one of the ramifications of there not being elections is also that it's not just about not being able to have elections and then the idea being that you have a strong parliament that can carry on doing its legislation. The fact is it actually has quite often the reverse. It impedes political progress because you get more and more divisions in parliament that form, that becomes much less difficult to be able to persuade because, of course, when you have new elections, a new mandate is delivered. So there are a lot of disadvantages too for Ukraine of their not being able to host these elections, as we've talked about before, and I think that very much highlights that.
Svitlana, I'd love to ask about how the Kursk offensive, and in particular whether or not the mood in Kyiv and elsewhere is buoyed by that, or if it's tempered with look at the cost it's coming at in the continued advance by Russia in the Donbass. But I think that's probably going to be an unfair question, as you were not in Kyiv when the offensive started. But if you have a good insight into that, then please, I'd love to hear that. But separately, on the political front, last time we did a bit of a dive into this, there were the first rumblings, the first possible signs of a slight distancing between Mr. Klitschko and President Zelensky. Now, obviously, different political parties, different backgrounds, but Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, has been very strong and resolute in his support for the president and the country since the start of the full-scale invasion. But there were just the start of some distancing, we thought. Did you detect any of that when you were in Kyiv? Is there sort of a possible return to politics as normal, or any widening of that gap between Mr. Klitschko, who is a very influential figure, obviously, very powerful figure, and the president?
Thanks. I will start from the first question about the mood. I would say that euphoria is a bit going down right now, because we see how the Kursk offensive actually didn't stop the Russian offensive in Donetsk, but it actually led them to advance more faster, because some of the units that were defending that direction were moved north to Kursk. That's why at the beginning there was a big criticism from Ukrainian influencers that they were thinking that Kursk offensive was intended to be something short-lasting, as several incursions that happened before in these 2 years of war. But then when it turned out to be a larger operation, the criticism became more silent. But we will see, I was told last year by one military expert from the US that Ukraine had to sacrifice something in order to achieve some result on the front line. And there was no chance that Ukraine could break through right now Russian front line in Donetsk region, in Zaporizhia region, because it is so well fortified. So Zelensky had to look for out-of-the-box solution, and I think most of Ukrainians support it now, seeing the results. About the relationship between Klitschko and Zelensky, they have been always bad. Since Zelensky came to office in 2019, they have been always rivals. And there were investigations by some Ukrainian journalists at the beginning that Zelensky's office tried to take control over mayor of Kyiv and the administration, because Zelensky has a habit of installing people that he trusts on all the important positions, and Klitschko was mayor and he opposed it, and back then he announced that he was pressured by Zelensky's team. So all of this was a bit forgotten when Russian full-scale invasion happened. But right before the Kursk offensive, Klitschko was blaming Zelensky about the war that has no end, that Zelensky doesn't know what he is doing, that he is installing people that he wants on important position. So it sparked again, but the Kursk offensive changed it and Klitschko had to be silent. But I think as soon as negotiations will be approaching, or even the elections in Ukraine will be approaching, the rivalry will become more heavy. I would say Klitschko has not been very respected in Ukraine in the last years because of the illegal buildings that he allowed to be constructed on Kyiv's historical sites, and some corruption in his closest circle. So a lot of people are criticizing him for it. But it's not time yet for the elections and political rivalry, so I don't think it matters for now. But in the future, of course, I think Klitschko will be one of the people trying to get elected for president.
Francis, can I turn to you first, please, for final thoughts?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dom. A little bit of a change of subject, but just wanted to flag that Oxford have very kindly invited me to interview the great Harvard historian, Professor Serhii Plokhy, on stage on Tuesday, the 27th of August at 6 p.m. He is, of course, a remarkable commentator on this war, having written many books both before and afterwards on the conflict and indeed the expectations of there being a future conflict, as well as being an expert on Chernobyl. And indeed, he's just written a new book about Chernobyl and the way in which, of course, it has been a new light has been thrown on it thanks to what's happened with it in this war and the whole idea of nuclear roulette. So I very much look forward to that. If you're interested and want to attend, I'll have the link in the show notes. I'm told tickets are still available, and very much welcome questions that I can put to him. So if there's anything particular you would like me to ask Mr. Plokhy, then do get in touch. You know my Twitter handle. It's always in the show notes, and indeed our regular email. Thanks to Oxford for reaching out. I look forward to doing it, though I won't be changing my boat race loyalties just yet.
Svitlana, as our guest, would you like to have the final word for today, please?
Yes, of course. I would like to maybe repeat somehow Zelensky's words that the intrusion into Russia has shown that there are no such things as red lines, and it proved that Ukraine could achieve if it didn't have the constant restrictions from the West. And I think now it is the crucial moment for Ukraine's allies to send the aid packages they needed to send to lift the restriction on striking Russia. And maybe this war will be over soon, and maybe negotiations will be there, but if Ukraine will have a stronger hands in them. So I think we are in a crucial moment of the war, and everything depends right now not only on Ukrainian troops who will try to seize and hold ground in Kursk, but also on our allies.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter or X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.